In the previous book in this series, our guest today observed the experiences of leaders on a roller coaster ride through their professional and personal lives. Now he follows them down the rabbit hole into the unknown, where, like Lewis Carroll's Alice, they find a dystopian wonderland in which everyone seems to have gone mad and life functions according to its own crazy logic. The first part of the book looks at the psychodynamics of leadership in both a business and political context. The second focuses on the psychopathology of everyday life in organizations and the seemingly endless ways people can make a mess of things. In short, sharp nuggets, our guest helps us make sense of how madness of the present has affected leadership of organizations and the workplace. It's a great honor to welcome one of the world's renowned authorities on leadership and a prolific author. We welcome the author of Down the Rabbit Hole of Leadership, Leadership Pathology in Everyday Life, Manfred Kets the Vries. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you on the show. I'm going to start with this beautiful part. You say Alice's Adventure in Wonderland has been a much-loved novel since its publication in 1865. It's fantasy and nonsense popular with children and adults alike. However, there is much more to the story than we initially think. Falling down the rabbit hole can be interpreted as a metaphor for entry into the unknown. And you use it as a metaphor for leadership tumbling down the rabbit hole. I'd love if you'd tell us a little bit about this metaphor that you use.
In the first place, I always say everybody is normal until you know them better. I always have been in praise of a certain amount of craziness. Of course, it's always a question of degree. And I wear two hats. One hat is, I always make the comment, I combine the dismal science, which was Keynes' description of the economist, and I was once upon a time an economist, and with the impossible profession, which was Freud's description of being a psychoanalyst. So I ended up being very poorly in both of them. I'm a terrible psychoanalyst in a way, because I'm not a very religious, ideological psychoanalyst. I do anything in my work that works. And I was, of course, influenced by, if you go through psychoanalytic training, you have to read during the course of the training, which is extremely long. That's the reason so few people do it, are crazy enough to take it. Freud's work, collected works, which are quite a number of volumes. And one, of course, the psychopathology of everyday life is one of his books. And I have in a way had a traditional academic career in which you have to write the famous papers for 8 journals, which you read, the editor reads, and your mother reads. That's usually the extent of reading. Then for some time, I was asked to be a columnist writer for a major Dutch newspaper. I'm originally Dutch. Although I wrote it in English, I must say, because I write easier in English at this point in time, and they would translate it. And what I did was, it forced me to write in a somewhat clearer way, because most academic writer is a lot of psychobabble. And one thing I learned as a psychoanalyst is to talk the language of your patient, of the client, patient, whatever. So and that's probably what people tell me, at least. I mean, I don't necessarily know that, but I think I'm a good synthesizer, and I'm good in presenting complex ideas in a simplistic way. So I can explain it to children what I'm trying to do. And I've written many books, too many actually, because book writing is quite important to me. And I discovered actually during the pandemic, I had this Boldino auto moment. And of course, you don't know what Boldino auto moment is. It comes from Pushkin. And Pushkin wanted to get married. That happens in life. And friends said, and he had a little estate called Boldino, which was far away from Moscow. And he wanted to go there to arrange everything. And his friend said, don't do this, not a good idea. Of course, he didn't listen. And off he went to that place. And when he was there, he discovered, there was a cholera epidemic. And so like the pandemic, he was not allowed to travel. You know all about it. He was stuck. Actually, and it was actually very good for him, because in those days, and still it's the case in Russia, you have censors. And he was lucky. He got his prime censor, the Tsar, a really personal interest. But the Tsar was no far away. So that was the most political moment. And coming back to your comment about the rabbit hole book, during the pandemic, it's now a little bit more than 1 year, I've written 6 books, which is completely nuts. And it reminds, because every morning, I mean, I here on my little mountain, every morning I get up very early and write for a number of hours, which makes me feel good. And then I putter around and do other things, have a walk, feed the wild boar. I have wild boar in the garden somewhere, and do other crazy things. And in the beginning, couldn't do anything because you were completely locked up. So the rabbit hole, which is about the psychopathology of everyday life in organizations, was, and in particular, of course, interest in leadership. And I got extremely irritated about the craziness of the Trump era, which is still continuing, the Trump code. So the book is very much colored by that. But I wrote another book called The CEO Whisper, which is part of my role. I run once a year. And at the moment it's stuck because even though my deans are trying to pressure me, I don't want to do it on Zoom. I can give lectures on Zoom for 100,000. I've done some 20,000 people. But that kind of program, I try to create tipping points because people come for 4 weeks, not in a row, by the way, over a year. Yeah, you don't talk about the weather. That becomes, you have too much other things to do. So you have to talk about serious things. And it's really a paradox because I'm a product of the Harvard Business School. As a result, I've written many case studies. I mean, case studies are there, the high priest of case studies. But I know, I mean, if you write a case study, you engage in self-censorship. And because you know that the final cut is done by the one who the case study is about. So you get all those hagiography. I see it all the time. And I have done it myself. And actually, some case studies I had to stop because the person wanted a hagiography. And I went, I felt the nerve was taken out of the case. But in the case of this workshop where I used the life case study, people, I mean, if you don't talk about anything, nothing happens. So you talk about things. And so that has been a fantastic laboratory for my work. And a lot of the psychopathology, apart from doing consulting and coaching or whatever, but it has been, and I guess one thing I have as an advantage, because I have 2 heads, which is maybe a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, coach, consultant. So I'm not very religious. You have all those, I wrote once an article called Coaching BS. Everybody in the kitchen sink is a coach, and they have all those, they start to differentiate themselves with whatever, master coaches and whatever it might be. And then you have behavioral coaches, skill coaches, career coaches, life coaches. I mean, you name it. I get quite tired of it. I'm completely, I'm reliable. I do anything. I do anything that works. I stand on my head to get people moving. I want movement. So I use lots of probably indirectly some theoretical concept, which I'm quite influenced probably. I mean, I can't help it by psychodynamic systemic theory. I'm interested by neurological theory and of course evolutionary theory, and of course developmental psychology is very important to me. And that all mixed up. And so I use what I sometimes call the clinical paradigm. And coming back to the rabbit hole, and also the Sherlock Holmes thing, I have to play a little bit Sherlock Holmes. Now, what you see is not what you get, and you have to make sense out of it. I just before I had a session with an executive and tried to make sense about some of the themes. And of course, in psychodynamic therapy, the role of transference becomes very important, which basically means no relationship is a new relationship, all relationships are colored by previous relationship. So you had a very autocratic father, you meet somebody, reminds you of your father, off you go. You go off into that rabbit hole. And so I have to explain to people like that what was the issue when you were 10 years old might not be an issue when you were 50. Maybe you can, accept certain things and behave in a different manner. And it takes time, by the way. There's no magic. We just talked about, what people like in articles, to do versus to be. That's one of the problems I have because, for example, I tell people if they come to my course to become a charismatic transformation leader, now go somewhere else. And anybody who promises you that is a snake oil salesman. But if you want to learn more about yourself and learn why you behave in certain ways, and also realize why you behave sometimes in maladaptive ways, and start to behave something differently, you might become a better leader. And usually when you talk about leadership, I've studied that for so many years. many derail. I mean, I'm just writing an article on the 7 sins, the 7 deadly sins. Of course, you know the 7 deadly sins?
Absolutely. I've done them all.
I hope so, because you practice them in a way everybody practices them all the time. It's a question of degree. It's of course lust. You have sloth, gluttony, envy, greed, and I think the most dramatic one is pride, which of course is related to leadership and the word hubris. And and I think there was 640 years BC, there was a gentleman, one of the Greek philosophers, who was asked what is the most difficult thing in the world. And he said, know thyself. It's also written about above the temple of Apollo in ancient tales. So actually it was the easiest sometimes to give advice, which is another which consultants may not like. But and so many leaders self-destruct. They suffer from hubris. And of course, you can say, is it nature or nurture and all these kinds of things. Of course, if there is not a big chunk of nurture, why bother what we're doing? Why bother to be a coach? It's all predetermined. So that's, of course, I've written on psychopathy. And of course, there are lots of neurologists make comments about the psychopathic gene and things like that. But still, if you take identical twins and would treat one very different than the other, you might even modify some of their behavior. But anyhow, so one is, of course, that leaders derail, which is also very interesting when you look at leaders. They don't know the people they work for and they work with. They have no idea. That's one of the things that always happens after the first module, that they start to have some meaningful conversation with the people because they have no sense. We have the fantasy that people think like we think. People think differently. And then, of course, I spent a lot of energy. It's kind of interesting when I look at my career, my somewhat portfolio career from economist, psychoanalyst, management professor. And then I became the head of, I was also actually an organizational pathologist. The glass was half empty all the time. I wrote this book 100 years ago called The Neurotic Organization, which had some effect about where I tried to make a connection between leadership style and organizational culture, strategy making. But at one point in time, I was asked by the then dean at my school, INSEAD, to set up a leadership center. And so I had to take pretty good material and make them even better. At the same time, I started a program, which is now a master's degree program, on change management. This was actually called Consulting and Coaching for Change originally. So it gave me a little bit of a different lens. And I think at this point in time, partly induced by the pandemic and irritated about the modern weapons of mass destruction, which is the social media, toxic leadership, I become a little bit more of a business philosopher. And I think the book you read is already a sign in that direction. And the books I wrote afterwards, like the CEO Whisperer. I wrote a book on the coronavirus, which I wrote last year, which my only ebook, because I know in publishers it takes too long. By the time it could have been outdated. So that was, then I wrote the book. I was waiting for the editing of the book, The CEO Whisper, and I wrote a book which people seem to like. I wrote it in a month. It's called Quo Vadis, not very original title, but it really, what I struggle with there. Now, what do people do? Coming back to your comment about to be, they're looking for meaning. And of course, the reason we look for meaning, sorry about my babbling along. Huh?
No, please.
I can babble for a long time. Must be my
please do
professorial narcissism or so.
Please do.
Meaning we all have in the cloud what you call this the stealth. Our stealth motivator is death. And death focuses. It brings us focus. Without death, there's no focus. So we wonder, there's always the question: how do you want to be remembered? What are people going to say at your funeral or whatever if you care about that? And you don't want to be the richest person in the graveyard, that kind of thing, which I tell some of the rich clients I have to do something more with their money. So when you dissect meaning, if you think it as in the middle of a circle, You have one thing is a sense of purpose, which is, by the way, purpose and meaning is different in a way, at least in my definition. Purpose is future oriented. You want to do something with your life. You want to accomplish something. So purpose. Then also, I think a major factor in meaning, and I used to be quite influenced by a book by a man called Robert White called Lives in Progress. You probably never read it, but it was based on a study done at Harvard with sophomores, which started in 1938. It's the longest longitudinal study about people's lives. Only men, by the way, it's only men. There were no women allowed at the time in Harvard College. And I think it has now a third director. This Harvard was a famous study. I listened actually to a speech by the last director. I went to an alumni session. I was so crazy to go to alumni at Harvard. So I went there, which is a depressing thing because you see how people age, which is not always in the best way. But the major thing they picked up was belonging. And if the importance of having good relationship with friends and family members, which also makes you live longer. It's very important. It's a stress reducing effect. And in my work, I put a lot of emphasis on it. Basically, at work, and I mean, I talked about the person just now about also his relationships with partners and things like that, and how he could improve that. And children. So that's the second one. The other one has to do with, and that has been a big peeve of mine. It has to be choice. My first university before Harvard was University of Amsterdam. And I must say that the education at the time was not exactly glorious. Actually, I spent most of my time not at the university, trying to study people sitting in coffee houses. That was probably my interest in organizational behavior and whatever came to the fore, because they were not very original in pedagogically. But anyhow, I decided I have not been back there for 50 years. How would it be like to give a talk there? So I wrote a note to the rector magnificus, which is the president of the university. Said, dear so-and-so, I never volunteer actually. People usually come to me, and so this time I volunteered and said, I would like to give a talk. And said, obviously it was no problem because she wrote me back, said, dear Manfred, I was your student, you might have forgotten. And the dean of the faculty you were is also your student. And talk about coincidence.
Yeah.
So there I was, and I was thinking, if I would have and think about the cohort of my class, what happened to them? Many are dead. Many of them made extremely bad choices about partners. They made very bad choices about career. And if they would have had psychology 101, would have been a little bit better in it. So in my school, we probably the most coaching-oriented business school in the world. And the only group which hadn't any coaching was, of course, the MBA students, because it's such a large group and it's very expensive. But now everybody has coaching, so that's good. And I've been when I became the director of the Global Leadership Center at INSEAD, so now coaching is in the DNA of the school, which resulted also that leadership center I set up doesn't exist anymore because I felt it was not needed anymore. It's not part by yeah, that's another story. But so the other factor in that meaning thing is sense of control about the ability to make the right choices. Of course, we don't do so well. I mean, you look at divorce rate and etc. The fourth one is also what are you good at? You are a sportsman. I've never been a good sportsman. I've never been good with my body. I mean, I'm not bad. I can climb a mountain, although I'm getting older now, and I realize that I cannot climb up mountains anymore. That's over.
You can chase wild boar.
Wild boar is relatively easy. Yeah, that's easy. But I once must admit, the wild boars were bulldozing my garden, and to the great disgust of my wife. So I finally took care of it. But
barbecue boar.
Not my favorite meat, that's to be honest. And also you have the after effect of the wild boar exercise, meaning somebody has to cut it up. That means yours truly. And that was not exactly, that's not exactly what I get quite excited about. That's not, No, I'm shooting you the boar in your pajama, and then at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then going into the rest of the deconstruction basis is not my. No, I guess it's funny. I had this to free associate. I was asked to do this lunch with the FT, which I felt was highly unusual because usually I had politicians and artists. So I don't know why a management professor must be the first got to luck. And this guy had probably done quite some research about me, and he kept on hanging on two things. One was wild boar hunting, which is a very complex. I mean, for that hunting, it's a very complex. I mean, I like nature. I'm a great believer in ecotherapy, and I think we need it. We are still actually other primitive human beings, Homo sapiens, other primitives in that respect. And the other thing has to do, again, I'm free associating, with the origin of my concern about leadership, particularly bad leadership. And it really has to do, and I once did a TED talk, which I was trying to explain that my grandfather and my mother hit lots of people during the war. And I don't know how my grandfather did it, because I later went to this little farmhouse, which he lived in, pas grand chose, not a big deal, and how he could hide 12, 13 people there. We talk about the pandemic and being locked up. Think about it, 5 years being locked up. And if you don't, I mean, of course, the pandemic, you can die too of the virus, but there, you had all the time, the Nazis running around and they pick you up. Amen. Amen. So it was, but I also remember as a memory that there was no television in those days. That was my grandfather. I was listening to the radio and Nuremberg trials of these war criminals. And I think that as a small kid, that really had enormous impact on me and what bad leadership can do. And that is probably the motivating force. Right? And that's the reason we come back to that book you mentioned, Down the Rabbit Hole, that I wrote on Trump. Actually, I wrote another book which is now being edited, called Leadership. That's being published now. Leadership Unhinged. And there's an enormous article. Part of it is Trump. I mean, I try to make sense of Trumpian thinking. And the next one is Bolsonaro, another hero of mine in Brazil, another one of those. I mean, real men don't wear masks. They don't cower behind masks. Of course, if you have invisible enemies like a pandemic or global warming, that's not like that. Real men fight other real men. So it might say something, as many people have said, about what kind of leadership do we need for the future? Is this the kind of leadership, this testosterone-driven leadership, do we need that? And I mean, as we know, except the lady in Hong Kong, female leaders have done better during the pandemic. Also, the lady of Hong Kong is a marvel in rationalization. I saw her just on the BBC a few days ago and explaining why all those people are being locked up deserve it and things like that. But that's another story. So I've now mentioned 4. The sense of competence. I was talking about physical intelligence. I mean, you must have lots of physical intelligence, that you were able to play sports quite well. I did some soccer, that was about it, but not very. Oh, there was some moments which I enjoyed it, no question about it. And I've been in very high mountains, 5,000 meters high. But I can tell you, it's not good, not for the faint of heart, because you have no oxygen. So your breathing becomes quite. And then when you have other forms of intelligence. So what I'm trying to say is, you try to figure out, what are you good at? When you think about your own career, what are you good at? What makes you feel alive? And I guess we share something. Understand? I see myself always as the insultant, not the consultant, the insultant. I'm the fool. I come to organizations. Somebody was saying it just now, recently, said the only person, it was yesterday, I was having lunch in somewhere at the coast. And said, you're the only person who gave a course on leadership in cartoons. And I think the reason I did it, because I had to get those very serious executives to giggle about themselves, so I could shove it to them. What they're doing wrong. So that's some word in the French language which nobody knows really. It's called morosov. And some of my people I worked with wrote an article about me in which they called it playing the morals. So meaning it's the fool of King Lear. Trying. Of course, finally, as you might discover, you get fired. As that's finally many cannot handle it after that. Although I don't mind getting fired. I was just telling it to a client this morning. I don't like with my client dependency relationships. I think they should be able to walk on their own feet. So I am willing to participate in whatever they want from me in a limited amount of time, and then the return on investment goes down rapidly. And it's better. And you can always call me later or whatever, and talk to me at lunch with me, but do your own thing. The fifth one is more glorious and maybe more relevant these days, which is sense of transcendence. I also got extremely irritated by my colleagues in finance who talked about shareholder value. And as you all know, we can manipulate it any way it's very easy to manipulate. And it's, of course, it has to have and then you have something called the tragedy of the commons. Have you heard of that?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's the selfishness about just if I take the last fish out of the ocean before somebody else takes the fish. So that's, it's a shared resource. So transcendence has to do with the ability to go beyond your own personal concerns. And in general, if you look at studies again, it sounds like taking is better. It's not true. Giving is better. You feel better. There's something to be said that actually the altruistic motive is extremely selfish in many ways because you help yourself that way. Giving is good for you. And, to express gratitude is good for you. To do things for others. And, I come from a low context language country. And we are not always good in expressing gratitude. And I guess I learned more about that because of my wife, who was Swedish, who was much, much better in it. But it's a good thing to do. And at this stage in my life, I got a funny story to tell you. Last year, when the pandemic started, I got a note from one of my students who is quite well known actually, who said, thanks to the seminar, a little bit late feedback 12 years later or 15 years later. I would like it a little bit early, it gets better. But at least when you get it then, they mean it. Thanks to the seminar, I become more courageous. He was not a very courageous person. As a result, I'm not firing anybody. I'm not firing my suppliers. I'm taking an enormous salary cut, and the whole executive team is going to do that. And I'm going to collect PPEs for the local hospitals. Ta-da! I was actually very proud of him. Wow. So those are the 5 things, which of course are not in that book you were mentioning, because that's the psychopathology of everyday life. And the way I write very often is that you or other people ask me questions and I have no idea. I have no idea how to answer it. And you have a fairly complex mind looking at the notes you sent me. It's like in my class, a person makes a presentation about their life. It's like a movie. So you're a documentary. So what kind of scenes are you going to present? And I listened to it and said, what is going on? I don't make any sense out of it. Of course, part of it is the problem is what's not being said, because they don't want to say everything. It's tell me everything, forget it. Nobody's going to tell you everything. So what is left out? So that's already one thing. But then the concept, I think it comes from Yeats, as a poet, negative capability, the ability to hold your confusion. That's and it's not easy, but I know that eventually my class will help me out. That's the reason I'm a great believer in team coaching. Team coaching, nothing about one-to-one coaching, great, but team coaching you get more bang for the buck. It's you get you create. It's easier to create tipping points, and at this stage in my life, when I do something, I want to have an effect. I have now an issue with one of my deans. I have stopped my leadership program. I can, as I said, give lectures to lots of people, there's no problem. But to do this very delicate program, I want to be 3-dimensional. And also hybrid doesn't work because people keep on staring at the screen. And so I guess I have to I have to explain that more carefully to them. This is extremely experiential. People deal with very difficult issues. And of course you can do something. But that's what they came for. And on top of that, they already had another module, so they know how it feels normally. So if you have the whole program that is going to be online, fine, it's possible. But a lot of the work of change is, when you talk about working through, you get an idea, a person tells you something, and you say, it's not true, it's not true. But then you start to think about it. Maybe he had a point. You work it gradually through and start to experiment. Maybe I should behave a little bit differently in these situations. And that's the reason the quick fix doesn't work. That's coming back to to be as opposed to do. I mean, I can give people some, and I do that too. I give people homework sometimes. I said, I want you to do homework. I gave some homework to a gentleman who had a very difficult time with one family member. Because, so I told him, next time you meet this family member at a family occasion, make an effort, surprise them, surprise yourself. Do some small talk, because that's important. I mean, small talk, it's very often, I had once an executive who was a candidate for becoming CEO of a very large company. The problem was he was too smart. He was too intelligent, but not wise, which is the difference between the two. I made a comment this week about trying to explain intelligence, knowledge, vis-a-vis wisdom. And I said, if you, in being intelligent and knowledgeable is that you know how to put a Kalashnikov together. Wisdom is when to shoot it. Yeah. Which is a terrible example, actually. But I think it's very demonstrative what it means. Yeah. So the wisdom about it, that you have some judgment, that you know when to use it. Let's use judgment. And some also the whole issue, the words of empathy and compassion, that they also play a role. But anyhow, that's... I already have a monologue for a long time. I had actually, interestingly enough, I did a thing for the Canadian Academy of Management, and the interviewer didn't realize that I was looking at the back of his hair. and I told him that, but he was actually anxious because he was organizing it for this large, it was online, it was live, and he didn't hear it. So I talked for an hour and a half to the back of some hair on the back of his head. And I must say, to pep myself up for an hour and a half, at least you smile friendly.
It's an absolute pleasure. And, the title even, Manfred, it jumped out at me. Our listeners are constantly listening to me going, let's go down a rabbit hole on this and that, etc. So the title totally jumped out to me. And I'm going to come back to a few things you said. I love your writing style. I think, I mentioned to you before we came on, the empathy for the reader is huge. Your empathy for the reader, to put it into, as you say, synthesized complex knowledge into simple language is a real skill. And I love the way you start with an example of an executive, then give some theory, and then end with a nice fable or an anecdote. I love that style, and they're all in essays. They can be read in any way, forward or backwards, etc.
As somebody said, I have it in the bathroom. Every time I go to the bathroom, I read one on the other article. And you can open the book anywhere.
Yeah. I hope they watched the book. Yeah. But so I wanted to share a couple of things. One, you mentioned Morozov, and that will escape many of our listeners. They won't know the term. You mentioned the fool. That may be taken out of context. It really, really resonated with me, that one. And you might have easily exchanged the executive you talk about here, whose name was Andrew, for Aidan. I'll quote this, and perhaps you'll expand on this idea, because I think it's such an important one, which is the idea of bringing a sense of humor into the workplace, not from actually wanting to be a fool, but actually be able to cover complex or often challenging conversations. I'll read the little excerpt about Andrew, the executive you talk about. Andrew was an enigma. His behaviour was untraditional, to say the least. It was difficult to figure out what he was all about, whether he was serious or just clowning around. You never knew what to expect from him. Some thought that he was a real pain in the neck. Many felt his mocking behaviour and bad jokes were over the top. It was clear that Andrew, loved playing the fool. He liked to challenge the status quo and play the disgruntled contrarian. He was always prepared to think the unthinkable, say the unsayable, and do the undoable. He was a virtuoso at making seemingly naive, foolish questions, yet there was often a lot of wisdom in what Andrew had to say, and his questions were often difficult to answer. His role was devil's advocate. He used many methods such as irony, sarcasm, humour to convey difficult messages, which usually led to creative dialogue. It challenged others' thinking and logic, so they ended up considering creative solutions that wouldn't have entered their mind otherwise. Now, many of our listeners are change makers or heads of innovation or transformative change makers within organizations or even C-suite executives, and many will play that role. And oftentimes when you do that, which I've done, it gets you in serious trouble. It actually is not great for your career sometimes, because if the tide changes suddenly and the mood of the organization shifts, the Andrews or the Aidans or the Manfreds often come under pressure. I'd love you to share a little bit about this, because I thought this was a key message.
I think, as you said, you can replace it for Aidan and or for myself. I mean, I'm certainly play that role. I use a lot of humor. You have a list of defenses, and when you talk about difficult people, they usually use the most primitive defenses, which is like you saw with Trump. It's splitting. The world has black and white cowboy hats, and of course, when they go to the white cowboy hats, it's denial. It's not me, it's somebody else, and projection. Those are very primitive defenses. The most sophisticated ones, of course, one of them is intellectualization, also humor. Although British humor, you're not British. I once had the honor of, running and being a facilitator for senior civil servants, and all Oxford and Cambridge, and of course I was completely out of it because I don't have that. But the venom of some of the humor was, you also wonder, there was not. But humor is a very good glue to get people going, and of course I make mistakes. Also, in humor I have to be very conscious, since I don't work in one country, because some humor is very culture specific. What works in Ireland may not work in Saudi Arabia. So I have to be, what are some more universal patterns which people can, and of course what always helps is also the element of presenting yourself somewhat vulnerable, which is important because if you want to create also in team coaching, now, when I run my leadership seminar, I only take one person per company because of confidentiality reasons. But I got once a request from a gentleman who said, listen, I like the program, and it was very useful for me. I would like everybody else to have it, but given that you only take one person a year, it will take 7 years. Can we do it all together? So no. So finally, I started to experiment with that, and it works very well. It has become kind of the tools. Also, the consulting firm I am somewhat of the honorary chairman of. That's, I think, one of their second. They're second to none in team coaching. But you have to. You learn to play. Also in the team coaching is much more complicated because there's so many people out there. And I play with them games. Imagine, Aidan, if you would be an animal. What animal would you be? And think about it.
An eagle. I always used to dream about being an eagle flying over Nevada or something. I don't know. When I was a kid, I always used to have that dream.
That's great that you know what you want. But how do other people perceive you? Do you see as a giraffe?
A lone wolf.
Oh.
Yeah, a wolf.
A wolf.
A boar.
Whatever. I was once in South Africa, and I did it with the executive board of a bank. And one person I had no idea, but they're very good in there because they know lots of animals there. So a fiscal shrike. Have you heard of a fiscal shrike? It's a little bird which it's the Vlad the Impaler of the bird world. So it kills another bird, usually smaller, and hangs it up high and dry to attract the other species.
Wow.
To be called by one member of your executive team to be a fiscal shrike, I guess I didn't know it completely. You cannot interpret as a somewhat hostile act, I think. It's not a friendly. What I'm trying to say is a little bit like the Bloomsbury group used to do, playing vegetable. If you would be a vegetable, would you be a tomato or asparagus? Would you be whatever? Beet, that kind of thing. And why? That's the question. Why? So what I do is I try to create a playful atmosphere and in the team coaching. And of course, what I do is I had out of desperation, out of protective reaction, and I'm not a good statistician, but I became a psychometrician. I developed a whole slew at the time, and I was the director of the global leadership of 360 psychometric instruments. Of course, I didn't do it alone. I teamed up with the best psychometrician in France, and a holy man, because I was trying to maybe something of shortcuts, but no, that didn't work. And so I needed it because to give my coaches a running start, that they had some material, because I didn't have the luxury of so much time because coaching is expensive we talk about programs at business schools. So that was quite helpful. And then, of course, when you are in a team and there are the results, and said, are you willing to share your results? And sometimes the results are not so glorious. And the people who have given you the results are sitting there also in the room. So as a facilitator, you are in a dilemma. Because if you you need 7 positive or something like that for 1 negative. And sometimes it's hopeless. When you look at some of the results, I remember once, a long time ago, I had one, and it was so bad. I said, my God, how am I going to do this? Actually, when I finally decided, okay, I have the guts to show to the rest, and he started to laugh. That's me. He said, that's me. And I'm good in a few things, but the rest thing, I'm hopeless. I'm hopeless. Anyhow, the thing is, you don't have to put on the blackboard or whatever, on the computer or the screen, the famous curves. You get curves and things like that. You're great in emotional intelligence. You're terrible in team building. You're a terrible coach. You're a visionary, whatever it might be. They know it. They see it. The thing becomes more interesting, I discovered. I did this work with a well-known premier strategic consulting firm. That's where I really practiced it, in well-known investment bank. To say, okay, tell your story. And that's very important. Tell your story. Why, you come from Cyprus, and now you're director of this glorious consulting firm. How did you do it? What happened? What went wrong? And people love telling stories. That's what we've done since Paleolithic times. Stories at the campfire. And so what are you going to talk about? And so that makes people more human. And so slowly the team becomes a team. I've said so many situations, and a person would call me, I have a nightmare team, and we have some very difficult transformational efforts to make. Please help me. How to get them to sing from the same hymn sheet, at least something, some same direction. And their team coaching can be, because basically the end of the road, if the facilitator does his or her job right, is that the people make contact with each other. And also they start to understand why a person is behaving the way he or she does. Actually, I made once a video clip because it's not easy, as you probably know, when you work quite experientially, to explain what you're doing. It's a different media. So I wrote a script, which is a real script after what I had experienced, but of course I couldn't film it. Phil put a camera when I had the meeting. So I hired a number of actors, and they acted that. And one also was a micromanager executive, and one was in some phone call there, which I did.
No worries. That's
A
live.
micromanager executive, and one was the chief knowledge officer, who was a disaster as far as organization was concerned. And so they got the message. And let's not expect dramatic change. But he learned, the chief knowledge officer, that he should probably have some people around him to organize him. He was never going to be, obsessional character being, but he started to realize what negative effect he had on the rest of the organization. While the CEO, who was too detail-oriented, started to realize that you have to create more playfulness in the company to get the best out of the people and make them more creative. So that's the reason I've been, I guess I'm probably one of the pioneers of team coaching. That has been perhaps one of the strengths.
I shared with you that I shared an excerpt on LinkedIn, and I started looking at the different characters, so the darker side of leadership that you talk about in the book. And I thought it was interesting because you mentioned Trump earlier on in the Trumpian era, and also psychopaths. My understanding is they're 1% of the population, 50% of that 1%, so 0.5% are in prison, the other half run organizations. So they're everywhere.
Special financial organizations, apparently.
Wow.
Very, very high.
But there was a really interesting thing you mentioned here. I'm just going to look for it in my notes, because you mentioned about dictators, and you mentioned Adolf Hitler, of course, and you said that dictators leverage a number of social processes and dynamics to gain influence and followership. First, they are extremely talented at inflaming wish to believe. Their cries of patriotism and righteousness mirror the message that the populace wants to hear. And people's unquestioning acceptance of a dictator's rhetoric is rooted in humankind's pervasive bias, that of confirmation bias. I thought that was interesting because the leaders we elect are almost a mirror of the zeitgeist of society, or how we're thinking. And I saw this a lot when Trump was elected. I'm sure you did too. That a lot of people were like, great, now we have somebody who's going to make a change, etc., etc. But then we discovered it was all playing to what people wanted to hear. I'd love your thoughts on that, because this happens in organizations, this happens at leadership level in any aspect of life.
I think you comment about zeitgeist, to use that German word. And in Germany at the time, they talked about das gesundes Volksempfinden, the healthy experience of the population. And Trump, probably because of the work he did in development, in construction, was quite attuned to what white, uneducated males experienced. And so, he said at one point in time that I love uneducated people. And that's, of course, one of the problems, because it's so, when you come back to the wish to believe, it's easy to sway people. I mean, I used to, in the beginning of my career as a teacher, I used to use sometimes a film called, I don't know if you've seen it. It's an impressive historical document called Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl.
Oh, the really old movie. It's on YouTube, actually. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's
horrible. Yeah.
It's the best propaganda movie. It's a model of the propaganda movie. Of course, Manfred was influenced by Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. And you see the use of symbolism and things like that, and sect formation. And of course, I was making the comment in my, that was in the book is coming, the leadership unhinged, where also Trump is playing a role, that psychopaths cannot lose. And a man like Trump, who has been conditioned by his father, Fred, never to lose. The world consists of two kinds of people, winners and losers, and never be a loser, like his older brother, who died as an alcoholic. So it is actually fascinating to me how he managed his loss to turn it around and have the sect believe that it was stolen. It's quite remarkable. It's now here's what you call, some people talk about the dark triad, but I don't believe in the dark triad. I believe in the dark diet, because they talk about Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. But Machiavellianism is part of the other two, so I think it's artificial to. So I talk about the dark diet, and this combination of psychopathy and narcissism is the worst form of narcissism. We all are narcissistic. It's all a question of degree. And without narcissism, you cannot function properly. But what you see often in organizations is this unfortunate marriage between disposition towards narcissism and position. You get into the position, and then funny things start to happen, because you start to be surrounded by people who suck up to you. In the case of Trump, it became so crazy that every meeting he had, people had to tell him he was the greatest. I mean, it's bizarre. It's surrealistic. Of course, they did it. Not they believed in it, many of them. They did it because you smell the roses, in this case, the power and whatever, the money and other things they could see. They conformed to that because they knew you have to amuse him, otherwise you get fired. But it's scary, and that's one of the major problems with executives. It's hubris, which means that you have to find a way to tease those people out before it's too late, before they have a real powerful position. And unfortunately, psychopathic people have a great capacity for mimicry. And Aidan, don't you love to hear what you want to hear? They tell you what you want to hear. It becomes a delightful person, delightful conversation. And the ones who don't get that kind of conversation are the people below them. So that's the reason 360s are sometimes useful, because you can quickly recognize toxic people in an organization. In a way, when you look at a simple matrix of 2 by 2, you have a healthy organization, a sick organization, healthy person and a sick individual. And you can see all different permutations. What very often happens when you look at another 2 by 2 matrix, one is results and one is values. So bad results, bad values, out. There's no hesitation. Then you have high results, high values, the goodies. Then you have good values, but mediocre results. Development is needed. Coach, get a coach. Maybe you will get better at certain things. But the problem cases are the people who have high results and don't live the values. And people let them sit there very often because they bring in the results, and in the meantime, they're toxic. And so you have to, as a leader, you have to make up your mind. And of course, psychopaths also the habit that they take credit for the work of others. So they're very good in exploiting people, which adds to this kind of messy situation. So, and as far as cure is concerned, forget it. I mean, there's this famous hair test of Mr. Hair. If you pass the test, lock yourself up and throw the key away, because psychotherapy is not going to help or whatever. They've actually seduced the psychotherapists, think it's whatever it might be. They're very good in that. I don't necessarily believe in the psychopathic gene, but there might be something wrong with the receptors, the emotional receptors in the brain.
You raised something there that is so common, where oftentimes leaders know about the narcissist, the malignant narcissist or the psychopath in their midst, but they keep them, or they actually hire them on purpose. And there's a great, I use this metaphor I'd love to share with you. It's called the black walnut effect. I call it. There's this tree called the black walnut tree, and it's a big, magnificent tree. But to grow big and magnificent, it releases a toxin called juglone, and juglone kills all the vegetation around it. And I thought, actually, that's exactly what these people are. And that moves nicely to narcissists, because you tell us not all narcissists are created equally, and that the literature on narcissism is mixed. While many people express some narcissistic tendencies, fully fledged narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, is less common. According to one study you mentioned, 6.2% of the general population have experienced NPD in their lifetime, all men, the majority men.
Yeah, that's actually coming back to leadership in the pandemic. It's actually an excursion, but has been quite a peeve of mine, that I think, and it was before, I already was mentioning that before the whole Me Too movements came up, most women have had some bad experiences. And that has created, the notion of vulnerability, compassion, empathy. Of course, you can say, women can do one thing, men can just give birth, and you have this whole oxytocin, the love hormone, and things like that. But still, it has to do with vulnerability. And I think it's an important role of good leaders to, when needed, to show empathy and compassion. And just having a testosterone kick, this kind of an addictive thing, it very quickly becomes a very selfish orientation. But coming back to your narcissism comment, I once wrote something about constructive and destructive narcissism. And as I said just before, that narcissism is actually the motor which for achievement. The question is how to keep it in control. And you have also mentioned dictators. I wrote a Swiftian article, well known about Ireland. He wrote the Swiftian article about what to do with the Irish. So it was quite terrible. I wrote something about something we should have more leaders for life. Now, the moment you have a leader for life, red flag should come up. I wrote it very sarcastically. In the center was this leader of Turkmenistan who had all those statues of himself and whatever. But it's the moment that you look at Xi and look at Putin, it becomes, you get a sense of entitlement. And so, I can see that in stressful situation, crisis situation, you cannot just sit around the campfire and discuss what needs to be done for hours and hours on end. So you need some decisiveness, but you always need countervailing powers, which has to do with the judiciary. You see it in Europe now, what's happening in countries like Hungary. Hungary is a good example of, who's not living the values of the European Union, and only taking advantage of the financial goodies that come with it. And so I think the Prime Minister of Holland, in a subtle way, told him to get the hell out of the union. Actually, that's what he said. Why do you want to be in the union except for money? If you don't live the values and so what I'm trying to say, you need independent judiciary, and very importantly, what's also not the case in Hungary, the press, an independent press. And of course, in America, you can ask yourself about the Murdoch family, who had an incredible control of public opinion. The same thing can say sometimes about the people who have been advocating Brexit, which of course is self-harm. It's self-harm with all the lies which are going on there by the leadership in the UK. But anyhow, I don't want to go there. I get quite excited about it because I have two children living in London, and it bothers me. It bothers me to have this kind of situation because it's so stupid, because they forget one major thing. Why was the European Union there? The main reason is not financial, or maybe indirectly financial. No more war. Think about all the war which were in Europe and the millions and millions of lives it cost to have a better understanding. Things like the Erasmus scholarships, which was the exchange of students. It stopped for the British. It's sad. It's sad. I think that the whole thing is very sad. It's self-harm for the next generation. And if in the sense of basically coming back to what happened also in the United States and Trump, nostalgia for certain things which cannot be. And France, of course, every country. I come from Holland, small country. We had the golden age, but we are not nostalgic about it. Maybe you can see some paintings in the museum and see some of the paintings, but otherwise we are not blowing that horn.
I feel the same about the politics, but I thought we'd speak through the organisation and reflect the organisation into...
But the thing is, the reason is that I get so irritated about demagogic-like leaders, and there have been so many lately. And then I get, of course, irritated about people who just step into those traps over and over again. I mean, and let them be seduced. I mean, it is not realizing that it's not easy always, by the way, because they're good snake oil salesmen, and you always have to wish to believe.
One of the ways you helped me understand that I mentioned about your empathy for the reader was the two stories. One was J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, because that power of the ring, and that can intoxicate people who go into the role. Actually, they're middle of the road people. They may not be really great people, but the power intoxicates them. That's one. And the other then is the empathy for the leader, which is the sword of Damocles.
The ring, of course, it comes from, I think it was Plato's story, That's where the story of Tolkien came from. And what would you do? And you ask, what would Socrates do if you find that ring? Would you live your values, or it's such seductive. The person who got the ring there, he found the ring. The shepherd found the ring, and basically what he did after he got the ring, he seduced the queen of the country and killed the king without anybody knowing it. That he killed the king. You can do so many things, and so of course Socrates sticks to his values. That was his particular. That if you are a value-based person, but it's very seductive. So the question, of course, is one of the reasons people come to my seminars. They want to have a little more balanced lifestyle, but often it's late in the game. And can they make enough reparation? Can they get closer to the children? They might be divorced, and all those kind of things might have happened because of their. On the other hand, it's like with your children. You want them to be successful, but you want them to be happy. And how to manage that in a proper way. It's very, so, happiness. I mean, there's lots of very happy people in the Côte d'Azur, I can tell you. If they, of course, if they have meaning, coming back to my meaning, that's another story. So it's a delicate trade-off. You want to provide meaning to your children. And I do a lot of work with family businesses. And if you want the family business to continue, you better start very early. It's not, and what often happens, of course, when you're an entrepreneurial type, which I've met quite, you make a lot of money, as you said, there's lots of sacrifice, and then you want to make up. So first the children get the kind of teddy bear, then they get a Porsche, and but they don't have the right values, and that's a problem.
I got so much from the book. Firstly, it's 25 chapters. They're all essays, and they all do as you promise, and I'm sure you do with your leadership. They make you think, and I live by this saying, and it's why I do what I do. It's why I do this show. It's why I write. Is that when you change what you think changes, or if you change what you see changes, because those new thoughts absolutely change your worldview. You mentioned lenses; you see the world totally different. But I wanted to link it to innovation because it's one of these thoughts that sprung to mind, and I'm sure you've worked with a lot of organizations driving change initiatives, 75% of which fail. And you said that
I sometimes say 70% to be more optimistic.
And I'm sure it's more than 75%. They're the ones who tell us it fails. But given this is what you say, and this jumped out, and I'm sure it will to our listeners. Given what we know about power's addictive nature, in situations where leaders hold a great deal of power, we shouldn't expect leadership transition to be a smooth process. Most people find it extremely hard to quit a powerful position. The world is full of examples demonstrating how difficult it is for leaders to let go. And I thought also then about this issue with family businesses that you mentioned. But I share that because we see it in innovation and change initiatives all the time. Leaders are full of rhetoric about change and the need to change, but when it means personal change to them, the status quo often prevails.
There's lots of written also on onboarding and things like that. I wrote recently a little article about offboarding. I mean, and one thing, now I deal with some executives who are, we live longer, so we have more portfolio careers. But I think one of the things one should be worried about, and your work, is board CEOs. Board CEOs are dangerous. They're dangerous because they're very easily seduced by investment banks and consultants to start doing they use the Pac-Man game, I should use buy and things like that to get some excitement in the system. So, you have a life cycle as you can be innovative. You are brought in because you have to clean up a mess somewhat. You may be brought in as a transformational leader, but after you've done that, maybe you should get out. I actually developed once a questionnaire called the Leadership Archetype Questionnaire, which was a result of some consulting work I did for a very successful bank. And I was saying that people play different roles. Now, leadership is a team sport. So what are the roles you play? One is, some people are really change makers. They're very good in that. Some, they like transformation. Some people make deals. I had one person, it was a joke, a deal a day keeps the doctor away. He needs to make deals. But after that, he was hopeless. At the time, I think we suggested that it was a director of McKinsey was put behind him to put things into place. So some people have the trains run on time. Some people are good coaches. I remember once working with another organization where the person was not a strategist. That was not his thing, but he was an excellent coach. He knew the top 50 people. He knew a lot about them. The top 100, he knew most of them. So he was continuously balancing his portfolio of people. So other people are innovators, which I think many innovators don't fit in organizational life. You know that. And they have very delicate plants who have to be watered all the time, and organizations don't allow for that. So they basically, that's the reason, look at pharmaceutical firms. Much of the innovation comes from outside. They buy it because they don't have it inside. They're too much involved in having the trains run on time, processes. And so and some people are very great communicators. And that's their strength, but it's a package. And so you have, as a leader, you have to see, okay, how I'm a designer of this team of people, how to get the best out of this team of people. Because this thing about the great leaders, it's usually a man standing on top of the pyramid. It's ridiculous. Also, I have written also that book you were referring to about the insanity of the pay scales. It's obscene. That is, he do it all alone. It can just be the economy. Thank you very much. He's just he's a passenger in the bus. The bus is going in the right direction, and so the economy is doing very well. But I mean, you see now, quote Warren Buffett, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked, and many of those people have been swimming. I mean, again, coming back to Trump and Bolsonaro, I mean, they have been swimming very, very naked. And also Boris Johnson. I mean, now he's got a lot of pomp and circumstances, but he has been swimming naked also quite a bit.
I heard a great line. You love this man because of your love for nature. Any turkey can fly in a storm. So they can all fly because the tornado is going, but when it settles down, it's like they all hit the deck. I've two more questions for you. One is based on the organization itself, and then there's the epitaph question, which I think is a fitting way to finish. But first, it's your beautiful term, the authentizotic organization. So,
finally.
Yeah, I love this. So based on many decades of your experience in consulting with global C-suite executives and organizations, you offer your observations on how to create high-performing organizations in which people can be their best and give their best. I love even how you phrase that. And you call these organizations authentizotic organizations. Beautiful name. I'll hand it over to you.
I made up the name. It's from two Greek words, authentikos and zotikos, basically organizations where you feel alive. And when you think about the Gallup polls about people engagement, something like 85% of people don't feel engaged. So they really work in gulags. It's terrible. I mean, we think about if you could turn that around. So one of the roles in my life is basically, it's a fantasy. I mean, for example, the seminar I come back to, probably this year, maybe 100,000 people. They have the responsibility for 100,000 people. If I can make that group a little bit more effective, maybe it has a trickle effect. That's and when you talk about authentizotic organization, I tell you an anecdote. I was once I flew to Denmark, and I was picked up by a taxi, and I had to go to a certain company. He said, "Are you going to Company X?" The taxi driver said, "I love to work for Company X. I love it. My brother works there. My father used to work there. I would love to work there." So the acid test of an authentizotic organization is, I mean, I have lots of terms. I have a whole description of it and whatever I wrote about it. But the acid test, to simplify things, is: do you want your friends and family to work in that company? That's the acid test. And most time when I ask other people, say no. But that is really the acid test, because it's a great place to be there. And if you have such a great company, you don't have to do much recruitment. It's word of mouth. And in general, I remember years ago, I wrote once a case study about Richard Branson of Virgin. And he had a very simple philosophy, I remember. He said, I want happy people working for me, because happy people will smile at their customers. That was at the time he said that. So, and it's true. It's a very simple recipe. If the people feel happy in their workplace, unless they are masochist, it's more likely that they will work better, harder, whatever.
So it's a beautiful term, and I highly recommend people read Manfred's work. Any of them, any of them, they're all so enlightening. But I wanted to end with the fitting end, which is the epitaph question. I thought it was a great way to finish this wonderful chat. And I loved this. So it is said that Alfred Nobel made the decision to institute his famous prize after reading about his purported death in a French newspaper that
close by here.
I thought I saw the irony of that. So it mistook him for his brother in Cannes that he died, and the article carried this headline. Imagine this being you: "The merchant of death is dead." And I often heard this term, and I really am very conscious of this myself. If our character is measured by what people say when we're not in the room, then an epitaph like that says a hell of a lot about you. And you suggest this is something we should all think about. And I thought it was a great way to finish today's chat.
You don't want to be the richest person in the graveyard. That's and it's you see, of course, when you look at I was on a panel recently of the BBC. And it was about the super rich, not just the rich, the super rich. And the last question, which was not aired because it was cut out, which was the question, at least my answer was not aired, which I found sad.
There'll be no editing here, by the way, Manfred. There'll be no editing. It's all going out.
I once was on a dissertation at Harvard of about temporary organizations, and of course, a film crew is a temporary organization, and it depends what kind of director you are. Are you an Hitchcock or an Arthur Penn? If you're Hitchcock, you're a set designer. You don't waste any meter of film. If you were Arthur Penn, 5 cameras are running, and you could self-actualize completely. But are you going to be in the film? Who knows? Anyhow, the question was very simple. If you would have $100 billion, what would you do with it? And I made a comment which was discouraged by my wife. I would educate women. And she said, you have to educate men also, but it's really true. It all has to coming back to, when you talk about the wish to believe and things like that, it all has to do with education. That's what has been my goal in life. When you talk about, since I got so bored when I was at university in Holland, I try to be an entertaining edutainer, whatever you might call it. I try to keep people alive and because that's the way when I listen to my children and grandchildren, they learn from good teachers, and so that's very teachers who stimulate them, and that's what. So that's one thing. When you talk about my epitaph, that he was a stimulating teacher, and create some tipping points for some people, who might make them a little bit more effective. And also, I always loved the statement I said with Margaret Mead about what a group of committed people can do, how they can change the world, if you're really committed to something. So coming back to my little seminar, of course, I do a lot of other things. But if I can change those people, it might have a little effect, small as it might be, on creating some of the better world which we need, given when I look at the day's news and the different newspapers I read, you don't get always a happy feeling.
I pulled a quote that I'm going to finish on. But before I do that, where can people find you and find out more about the Kets Vries Institute, etc.?
Yeah, it's very simple. For the Kets Vries Institute, you type in Kets Vries Institute in Google. And for me, you can go to LinkedIn or something like that and type in Kets. It's not rocket science. Actually, after I got this article from Lunch with the FT, which was my surprise lunch, which, as I said, the person focused on my political incorrect activities like hunting wild boar or so. And I couldn't defend myself because I was trying to explain, it's how to get an equilibrium, in nature equilibrium. That's but that's the whole story itself. And then, of course, the Holocaust, how it influenced me. I got 500 emails after that. Not from people who were against that. It was all positive, I must admit. Maybe negative ones control themselves, but it was not so. And I'm a very religious person, meaning I answer my email.
Very good.
Although in the book, The CEO Whisper, which I have here, it's an introduction. I say something about that I see myself sometimes as a combination of Dear Abby. There was this column in the newspaper, Dear Abby, and the Jerry Springer show. Where I get the craziest emails, and sometimes I feel like you probably don't know that cartoon figure, Mr. Magoo.
Oh, I do, yeah.
Who's talking around and say, "What the hell is what the hell?" Like Alice in Wonderland, too. What the hell is going on? Try to make sense out of various things.
Brilliant. Well, I pulled a quote, and maybe I'll ask you just after this quote, just your final message for people working in organizations after this. So I love this. There was so many, but I thought this would be a nice one to finish with. You say that hope can bring light in the surrounding darkness. As the great novelist Dostoevsky put it, to live without hope is to cease to live. What these dystopian tales teach us is that when we join together, inspired by the hope for a better future, we will have a chance of survival. Only by working together can we set everything to rights. We should remind ourselves that big things tend to have small beginnings. If we take life one day at a time, we can handle just about anything. If each of us takes a small step every day toward making things better, we may eventually get where we want to be. I absolutely love that. What about you? Your final message for our audience?
I wrote once a little book on happiness. I was quite depressed when I wrote that. You have to be depressed. Bertrand Russell was also depressed when he wrote on happiness. I think it must be a pattern. And I think the theme of that book was, and it's not original. I don't know exactly who was the first one who said so. It might be Immanuel Kant or it was a Chinese proverb. But happiness is something to do, someone to love, and something to hope for. And actually, it's quite profound when you think about it.
Author of multitude of books, including the focus of today's show, Down the Rabbit Hole of Leadership Pathology in Everyday Life, Manfred Kets de Vries. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.